People talk about love between father and son like it's unbreakable. They say blood's thicker than water. But I learned the hard way. Sometimes blood turns to poison. My boy's name is Daniel. I named him after my father, a man of honor, a man who taught me that respect was the only currency worth carrying. I raised Daniel with the same lessons: honesty, hard work, loyalty. But somewhere along the way, he spit those lessons back in my face. It started small. He was 16 when he first raised his voice at me. Just a teenage boy. I thought, hormones, rebellion. I let it slide. But disrespect has a way of growing like rot. The first crack in the wood doesn't break the beam, but leave it long enough, and the whole house caves in. By the time Daniel was 25, the boy who once held my hand crossing streets looked at me like I was dirt. He sneered when I spoke, mocked my age, mocked my work. "You're a relic, old man," he said once, "clinging to a world that doesn't exist anymore." Relic, that word burned hotter than any insult I'd ever known. Still, I swallowed it, because he was my son, my blood. But swallowing poison doesn't make it go away. It just festers. I worked my whole life running a small construction company. Not much, but enough to keep food on the table, roof overhead, and a little savings for the day my hands couldn't grip a hammer anymore. Daniel never wanted any part of it. Said it was beneath him. He wanted more. Fast cars, flashy clothes, easy money. He thought hard work was for fools, and fools in his mind included me. I tried to steer him right. Gave him chances. Paid for his schooling when he dropped out the first time. Covered debts when he gambled. Even bailed him out of jail once after a bar fight. Each time I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe he'll change. But each time, he sank deeper. Then came the night he crossed the line. It was late, a summer night heavy with heat. I was asleep when a sound woke me, the creak of a floorboard in the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. But then I heard it again, slow, careful. I reached for the bat I kept under my bed. Years in construction taught me that sometimes the only language a man understands is the weight of wood in your hands. I crept to the doorway, and that's when I saw him. Daniel, my son, standing in the hallway, holding one of my kitchen knives. The moonlight caught the blade, and for a second I swear it glowed like ice. His face, it wasn't drunk, it wasn't high. It was calm. Too calm. He didn't see me at first. He was moving toward my room, toward my bed, toward where he thought I was sleeping. I felt my chest tighten, not with fear, but with something colder. Betrayal so sharp it nearly cut me in half. My own son. With a knife, I stepped into the hall. Daniel. He froze. His eyes widened, then narrowed. "You should have stayed asleep," he muttered. "Why?" I asked, my voice low. "So you could finish me?" He didn't answer. His knuckles went white around the handle. I gripped the bat tighter. Put it down. For a moment I thought maybe he'd listen. Maybe some small flicker of the boy I raised was still in there. But then he lunged. I swung instinctively. The bat cracked against his forearm, sending the knife clattering across the floor. He screamed, clutching his arm, but he wasn't done. He tackled me, fists flying, teeth bared. We crashed into the wall, picture frames shattering around us. His fist split my lip, the taste of blood flooding my mouth. I shoved him back, gasping. "Why, Daniel?" I roared. "Because you're in the way." He spat, eyes wild. "You're old, you're weak, and everything you've got should be mine." Everything I've got. My savings. My company. My house. He wasn't just trying to kill me. He was trying to erase me. The rage that surged through me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever felt. Not just anger, a cold, focused fury. I grabbed the bat again, ready to swing. But Daniel scrambled back, clutching his arm, and bolted for the door. He vanished into the night, leaving me bleeding, shaking, staring at the knife glinting on the floor. My son had tried to kill me, and failed. But next time, I knew I might not be so lucky, and that's when I made my decision. If blood had turned to poison, there was only one cure. I would survive. I would fight back, and I would take revenge. Asterisk. After he ran, I sat on the floor with the knife at my feet and the taste of blood in my mouth. My house hummed with the quiet of a place that had never expected betrayal from its own blood. I looked at my hands, knuckles split, fingers trembling, and felt something shift. Not fear, not surrender. A determination as simple and steady as a metronome. He tried to kill me. A son, a boy I had taught to tie his shoes, to hammer straight, to say please and thank you. He'd stood in my hallway with a knife and tried to end me because I was in the way of his wants. There are two kinds of men after a thing like that. The ones who let it crush them, and the ones who learn. I decided in that moment I would learn. First, I counted. The money, the land, the company books. I knew where every bill was filed, where each account sat. For decades I'd kept ledgers under the loose board in the office floor and an old shoebox in my closet. He thought he could take everything by force, but I had hidden things a greedy son wouldn't know to look for. Second, I bled up. The cut on my lip scabbed in a week, but the anger didn't fade. It crystallized. I stopped sleeping in his room. I put locks where there were none. I learned to move again like a man ready for winter, careful, silent, deliberate. Third, I told no one everything. You can't heal a man with strangers' pity. I told myself the truth and wrapped it tight like bandage. The sheriff? He'd been helpful in the past, but involving the law would make this public. Daniel craved spectacle. He'd thrive in a courtroom, turn victim when it suited him. No, this had to be quieter, more personal. So I began to watch. I watched him from the edges of my town, from the back rows of the hardware store, from the familiar bench near the diner where old men read the paper and swapped news. He thought himself clever. He had a temper, sure, but he also had habits. Late nights downtown at the bar that smelled of oil and spilled beer. A girlfriend who hadn't the patience of saints. A friend who winked too easily while Daniel counted other men's cash. I learned where he kept his pride, and that was where I set my sights. The first plan was simple. Make him think he had already won. Let him show his hand. Let hunger for what he believed was his lead him to take bigger risks. A man who thinks the world is his can't smell the trap until it's too late. I started with his friends. They were men of convenience, pocket-sized loyalty. A call here, a memory dropped there, and one of them confessed in a bar about a late-night deal Daniel bragged of. Cash, quick turnover, high margins. I listened like I'd listened when he told me his first jokes at 4 years old. I smiled and nodded, let the alcohol loosen tongues. Then I fed the right ears. An old contractor in town, Joe, owed me a favor from years back when I'd fixed a roof for his sister for nothing. I asked Joe to be patient, to wait a week before he tried Daniel's new supplier. Joe called and warned a few men. "Check the timber," he said. "Ask for mill numbers." A seed of doubt planted. I watched consequences grow. Daniel rubbed his hands with that guilty satisfaction men get when they think they've tricked the world. He would be arrogant now, reckless. So I arranged for paper to bite him. I phoned a supplier in the next county I'd done business with 20 years earlier and asked about delivery. The man hummed, a sound like a spark. He mentioned a bad batch. I didn't have to say more. Contracts shifted. Orders canceled. Panic spread in his office like mold dot, but money and business weren't all. This was about the man he'd shown himself to be. Betrayal, like his, leaves marks that aren't financial. It leaves fingerprints on ambition, on relationships, on the trust you can't buy back. Daniel needed to be unmoored. He needed to float in a sea with no shore. That was cruelty, yes, but it was also truth. If a man chose to try to kill his father, he had chosen to burn his moorings. With patience I pulled threads. An anonymous note to his landlord about late visitors, a chance for inspection. A quiet call to his employer from someone with a question about character. That little seed sprouted rumors. I swapped envelopes at the bank, not to steal, but to make sure a loan notice was misdelivered. Small chaos breeds big panic. There were nights I froze at what I was doing. I remembered when I'd taught him to balance on a curb, to ride a bike without training wheels. I remembered his toothless grin when he first called me Dad. Those memories clawed at me in the late hours, and for a long while I sat with them like companions I couldn't banish. But I also reminded myself of the knife and the way his hand tightened around it. That returned me to purpose. I also reached out, not to enemies but to allies. Not men of power, but men of memory. The town remembered me. They remembered the man who'd hauled extra lumber for free when a family's roof blew off in a storm. They remembered the handshake that still meant something. I didn't have to sell them on who I was. They already kept that ledger tucked in their minds. A visit here, a favor there, an overdue invoice paid, a truck loaned for a week, and I rebuilt a small scaffolding I could stand on. Some of this was petty. I'll admit that. I left a voicemail on his cell that played at midnight, a recording of our old answering machine, the one that used to pick up with my wife's laugh on it. I wanted him to remember. Little things like that unhinged him more than 100 angry words could. He'd get a call, listen to that laughter ghosting through, and stumble into a day thinking himself haunted. But while I nudged the corners of his life to fray, I also prepared for when he'd come back. He would, greed like his rarely stays far from the source. He would return thinking me weak, thinking the wounds he'd left would have scabbed over. He would be wrong. I widened my doorways. I trained my hands in old reflexes I'd forgotten. I dug up the little arsenal I'd put back when the boys were small, a tool for every need, and, if the worst came, a place to put a man down without singing about it. Not because I wanted to be violent, but because the world is blunt and sometimes requires bluntness. Every night I checked the locks, the windows, the traps of my house. Every morning I walked to the shop as if going to work. Men nodded, tipped their hats. To them, I was just the old man who wouldn't let go. To Daniel, I was enemy number one. And all the while I watched and waited, counting costs, measuring each breath. When he finally came back, and he will, I'd have more than numbers in my pocket and allies at my back. I'd have the advantage of a man who understood where the blood runs, who knew the contours of his son's pride and where it would splinter. I'd learned that survival was not a single blow. It was an accumulation. It was every small choice you made after the worst thing that could happen. It was patience, planning, the long, slow work of dismantling a life built on greed. Daniel thought a knife in the dark would end me. He was wrong. The knife had not ended me. It had sharpened me, and now I would finish the blade. Asterisk, asterisk, he did come back. Of course he came back. Men like Daniel don't stay away from the table long when they think there's still a feast. They don't walk away from what they think belongs to them. I saw him first at the edge of town, in the cheap neon of a late-night convenience store. He stood under the flicker of the sign, shoulders hunched against the cold, face sharper than before, eyes that darted like a cornered animal. He looked like a man who'd been running for a long time. I watched him from across the street, watching the way he watched the world, half calculation, half fear. He hadn't learned humility. He'd learned to hide the truth better. I knew then the moment had come to step from watching into action. The trap had to be clean. No melodrama, no messy roping of innocence. He'd already tried spectacle and attempted murder in a hallway. He'd shown the world what he was capable of. Now I would show the world a different thing. The consequences of a man who burns his roots for ash. I called a favor from Joe, the contractor who had learned to respect a handshake the hard way. There's a house on Willow, I said. A renovation, good money. I need a team that can turn quick and quiet. Promise you'll keep men honest. He grunted, the sound of a man who'd sold me lumber in a storm. I handed him a check under the table and a name, a fake one, a name nobody in town would immediately trace back to me. But Joe didn't ask questions. He just nodded. Then I called a cleaner friend who drove an old work van without GPS and paid him cash to park near the property for the week. I called a young couple who owed me a favor and asked them to take a short-term lease on a small unit above a hardware supply. They agreed for old reasons. Bread for the family, a nod for later. Nobody was asked to risk anything they didn't already owe me. Everything I did was small and explainable. A crew begins work on a house. A van parks. A couple moves in. Routine. But under that routine, I built something tight as a noose. We picked the house because it sat on a quiet lane behind the old mill. A property that once belonged to Doc Harlan and had been sold after his death. It had a back door that opened on a side alley and a cellar window perfect for a man who wanted to be unseen. That cellar door was the key. I called the sheriff in the end. I'd avoided the law after the knife because I feared Daniel's ability to turn grief into sympathy. But this time I wanted the law. I wanted what the law could do that I could not. Make a crime stick publicly. Make men who had imagined themselves untouchable pay in ways a private revenge could not. The sheriff agreed to meet me quietly. He had seen the bruise on my face and heard the rumor of what had happened months prior. He didn't like what a young man with knives could mean for a town. We planned it together. Surveillance, evidence, a clean arrest when the man acted. The bait was simple. A rumor spread. The old Doc's property had vintage tools hidden in the cellar, rare bits Doc had collected. Who would pass that up? Not a man like Daniel. I let the rumor leak through the right men, through Joe, who mentioned an old box of chisels found in the wall, through the clerk at the hardware store, who heard a collector in town had his eye on the place. The rumor tasted of greed, and greed was Daniel's favorite meal. For 3 nights I slept with the radio on, one ear open. For 3 nights I watched the lane from my kitchen window, the dark like a curtain pulled across a stage. On the 4th night, at 2 in the morning, headlights cut through. A sedan coasted down the lane and pulled near the property. A man got out, hood up. He moved like a shadow slipping into the garden. I called the sheriff, whispered the spot, drove my truck to where I could block his escape if needed. My hands were steady. I felt neither fear nor triumph, only a grim focus the way you feel when you're about to cut a rotten section from a beam. Necessary, hard, clean. Daniel climbed the fence like a ghost. He slipped to the back, knife sheathed on his belt, though it had meant to be used without sheath months earlier. He should have been careful. The man had been careless his whole life. That night, carelessness would be his undoing. He found the cellar door and worked the latch, fingers deft from years of petty theft and midnight breaks. He levered it open and dropped down. He moved toward the cellar light with that arrogant gait of a man who believes the world is a buffet. When he found the box breadcrumbs of Doc's life, chisels wrapped in oilcloth, his mouth formed a small, greedy grin. He reached out to take it, and that was when floodlights came on. Stop! A voice shouted from above. The sheriff's men poured from the hedges like a net tightening. Daniel spun, panic widening his eyes. He bolted for a side window, but the deputy was already there, hand on his shoulder. Voice firm and practiced, I climbed down the cellar stairs like a man going to his own ending. Because part of me had already died the night my son brought the knife to my hallway. He looked up at me then, face pale under the electric glare, and for a moment I saw the boy who used to ask for a bedtime story. Why? He breathed like a child asking why the sky is blue. For the same reason you came, I said. Because you thought something belonged to you. The sheriff cuffed him gently, more careful than the law book required, as if he wanted to preserve what dignity remained for both of us. Daniel's feet kicked the air, a thrashing of a trapped animal. He yelled that I was a coward, that I'd set him up, that the town would never forgive me. The deputies ignored him. They had heard worse from worse men, and they were tired of losing neighbors to violence. In the days that followed, the town watched the story frame itself in its own slow, merciless way. A local man arrested for breaking and entering, evidence of past aggression noted by a weary sheriff. People took sides, as people always do. Some whispered that I'd gone too far. Others nodded and said it was about time. The young couple above the hardware store got their savings and a vacation I paid for. Joe got his check. Men returned calls with quieter voices. The sheriff tipped his hat to me once, and in that nod I saw something like absolution. Daniel sat in a cell and had time to think. People visited one or two, faces flushed with pity or disgust. The papers printed a small paragraph. Local man arrested in break-in at former Harlan estate. Investigation ongoing. No one knew about the knife in my hallway except the sheriff and me, and that was how I wanted it. Let his own choices be the headline. Let Lawman seal a fate he had started by his own hand. When I walked past his cell on my way out of the station, he shoved the blame out like smoke. "You set me up," he shouted. "You're the one who called them." I stopped, put my hand on the iron bars, and looked at him, the son who had once held my hand crossing streets. The same hand that clenched a knife in the dark. "Maybe I did," I said quietly. His eyes narrowed, confusion and fury warring there. "Why would you—" "Because you tried to kill me," I said, "and because sooner or later the law needed to catch what my hands could not afford to finish for me." He spat at the concrete. "You'll regret this." "Perhaps," I said. "Or perhaps you'll finally learn what it cost to take from your blood." He kicked the bars, harder now, and slammed his forehead against the metal. He groaned, hand pressed to his head. A deputy came, checked him, and left. I walked out into the sun, and for the first time since he had stood in the hallway with a knife, I felt slightly less like a man pushed to the edge. Not healed, not whole, but lighter with the truth turned visible, public, undeniable. The law had not given me revenge. It had only placed a mirror before my son. It would be up to him to look and understand what he'd done. I had set the trap. The rest was on him. The morning after Daniel's arrest, I woke before the sun. Old habits die hard. I'd spent my life rising early, listening to the world stir itself awake. But that morning the silence felt different. I poured myself coffee and sat at the table, staring at the steam curling up like smoke. For years my mornings had been haunted by the memory of footsteps in the hall, the glint of a knife, the betrayal of blood. But that day the knife was gone. Daniel was locked away, Dot, so why did I feel no peace? Word travels fast in small towns. By noon, whispers carried from the diner to the barber shop, from the barber shop to the post office. Folks looked at me differently. Not with pity, not with admiration. Something in between. Some tipped their hats, respect in their eyes. Others avoided me like betrayal might be contagious. I couldn't blame them. A father turning his son in, no matter the circumstances, unsettles people. Dot at the hardware store. A man I'd known 40 years said, "Tough break, Tom." His voice was heavy, like he didn't know whether to console me or judge me. "Tougher than you think," I muttered, and left without finishing my order. That night I dreamed of him as a boy. Daniel at 6 years old, running through the yard, his laugh ringing like bells, his hands sticky with popsicle juice, his small voice calling, "Daddy, come push me higher on the swing." I woke with tears on my cheeks and a hollowness in my chest that even revenge couldn't fill. Because here's the truth. No one tells you. Vengeance doesn't cure betrayal. It only balances the scale with more pain. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that I had saved myself, protected what I'd built, shown him consequences. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw a man who had destroyed his own blood. A week later, I went to see him. The sheriff raised an eyebrow when I asked, but he didn't stop me. Daniel sat on the other side of the glass, orange jumpsuit hanging loose, his eyes sunken. He looked older than his 20-some years, like the fire in him had burned itself out. When he saw me, his lip curled. "You proud of yourself?" he hissed through the receiver. "No," I said flatly. He blinked, not expecting that. I didn't do this because I was proud, I continued. I did it because you left me no choice. You could have talked to me, he snapped. I laughed bitterly. Talked to you? Like the night you came into my house with a knife? Was I supposed to sit at the kitchen table and chat about your intentions? His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. I gave you everything I could, I said, my voice low, and you spit it back at me. You disrespected me, shamed me, and then you tried to end me. Don't stand there pretending I had options left. For a moment, silence, and then he leaned forward, eyes burning again. You think this is over? You think bars can stop me? You're wrong, old man. The day I walk out, you're finished. I stared at him, and for the first time I felt something colder than anger. Pity. Then maybe, I said quietly. You'll never walk out. I hung up the receiver before he could reply. The months crawled. The case went through the motions. Arraignment, hearings, trial. The evidence was plain. Breaking and entering attempted burglary, priors. His record spoke louder than I ever could. I sat in the back of the courtroom, listening to lawyers spit words like premeditation and reckless disregard. I didn't speak. I didn't testify. The sheriff and deputies carried that weight. When the verdict came, guilty, Daniel's head dropped. I thought he might cry, but instead he laughed. A sharp, broken sound that chilled me. They sentenced him to years in prison. Not life, but long enough. Long enough for him to feel the walls closing in. Long enough to remind him that greed and hate have consequences. But as they led him away, he turned his head just enough for me to hear his whisper, I'll remember. And I knew he meant it as a promise. Afterward, people told me I'd done the right thing. The sheriff shook my hand. Neighbors offered me pie, casseroles, half-hearted smiles. They tried to comfort me with phrases like, you had no choice, and maybe he'll change inside. But nights were still long. The house still echoed with memories. I'd sit in my chair, staring at the door, waiting for footsteps that would never come again. I'd won. But in winning, I'd lost something greater. One evening, I walked to the cemetery. Mary's grave sat beneath the old oak tree, where the leaves whispered with the wind. I knelt, brushing dirt from the stone. I tried, Mary, I whispered. God help me, I tried. I gave him every chance. But he chose his path. The wind rustled the branches, and for a moment, I imagined her voice answering back. You did what you had to, but that didn't soothe the ache. I left the cemetery with one truth heavy on my shoulders. Revenge had kept me alive, but it had cost me my son, and maybe, just maybe, that was a price no man could truly bear. Yet deep down I knew one thing more. Daniel wasn't done. His words echoed in my skull every night. I'll remember. The day he walks free, he'll come for me again. And when he does, I'll be waiting, because blood may turn to poison. But once you've tasted that poison, you never forget its flavor. And I won't be caught sleeping again. Asterisk, asterisk, years passed. The world changed little by little. I grew older slower. My hair thinned, my back ached in the mornings, and my hands, once steady as stone, sometimes trembled. But one thing never changed, the memory of that night in my hallway, the glint of a knife, my son's eyes cold and sure, and the words he'd whispered after the verdict. I'll remember. I lived with them carved into my bones. The day he walked free was hot and heavy with summer. I heard it from the sheriff, who called me in the morning. "They're letting him out," he said quietly. "Time served. Good behavior." I laughed bitterly. "Good behavior, Daniel?" "Behind bars, maybe," the sheriff replied. "But be careful, Tom. You know him better than anyone." "I do," I said, and hung up. I spent the day preparing. I oiled the hinges on the doors. I checked the locks. I even pulled the old bat from under the bed, the same one that had saved my life the first night he tried to end me. But I knew this wouldn't be like before. He wasn't coming for a quick kill. Not this time. He'd want me to suffer, to watch him tear apart what little peace I'd built. That's why I built my own plan. I'd kept the house quiet all those years. But in the barn out back, I had turned it into something else. A place of work. A place of traps. Every tool I ever used in construction had found new purpose there. Nails, wire, boards, chains. The barn was no longer just a barn. It was a cage waiting to be sprung. He came at night, like I knew he would. I heard the crunch of gravel first, the soft creak of the gate. My heart pounded, but my hands were steady. I sat in the living room chair, the lights dim, the shotgun resting across my knees. The door opened. He didn't even try to be quiet. He stepped inside, taller now, older, but the same sneer on his lips. His eyes locked on mine. Double quotes. "Hello, Father," he said, voice like poison. "Daniel, you look older. And you look like a man who hasn't learned a damn thing," I said. He laughed, sharp and cruel. "Oh, I've learned. I've learned patience. I've learned to wait. But I haven't forgotten. Not a single night. You set me up. You ruined my life. You ruined your own life," I snapped. "The day you picked up that knife, you made your choice." His smile faded. "And tonight I make another." He pulled a blade from his jacket, bigger this time, serrated. His hand didn't tremble. "Not in my house," I growled, rising to my feet. He lunged. The shotgun roared, but I'd loaded it with rock salt, not buckshot. I didn't want him dead, not yet. The blast caught his side, and he screamed. Dropping to a knee, I kicked the knife from his hand, grabbed him by the collar, and dragged him out the back door, across the yard, into the barn. He struggled, cursing, but I was stronger than he thought. Rage is a powerful fuel. I threw him inside and slammed the door, bolting it behind me. The barn lights flickered on, revealing everything I'd built, chains hanging from beams, nails driven into planks, wires strung like snares. Tools lined the walls, each one repurposed. Daniel's eyes widened. "What is this?" "This," I said, stepping closer, "is where I teach you the last lesson you'll ever learn." What followed was not quick. He came at me again, fists swinging. I dodged, grabbed a length of chain, and wrapped it around his arm, yanking it hard until he screamed. He tried to break free, but the chain only tightened. "You never respected me," I hissed. "Not as a father, not as a man. Tonight you'll learn respect." I shoved him into the corner, where wire snares caught his legs. He fell, cursing, thrashing, but every movement only made the wire bite deeper. Blood dripped onto the dirt floor. "You could have had everything," I said, circling him. "My company, my land, my blessing. But you wanted it faster, easier. You wanted me gone." He spat at me, face twisted with hate. I still do. I smiled coldly. Then you'll have to do it from hell. He lunged again, breaking free of the snares, but I was ready. I swung the bat, the same bat from that night years ago, and cracked it across his jaw. He collapsed, groaning, teeth scattered in the dirt. I stood over him, chest heaving. For a moment I thought about finishing it right there. One more swing, and it would all be over. But I stopped. Killing him would have been too easy, too quick. He needed to feel what I had felt all those years, the slow poison of betrayal, the weight of loss, the cage of consequences. So I bound him in chains, wrists and ankles, and left him on the barn floor. Every day you sit here, I said, voice low and steady, you'll remember what you tried to do to me. You'll remember that a father's love can turn colder than stone. And you'll remember that respect isn't given. It's earned or it's taken. His eyes burned with hate, but there was fear there too. For the first time, real fear. I turned off the lights and walked out, leaving him in the dark. People will ask me someday what happened to Daniel. I'll tell them he left, that he never came back. They'll shake their heads, mutter about troubled sons, and move on, but I'll know the truth that in my barn lies the son who betrayed me, chained by his own choices, learning at last a lesson he refused to hear when I tried to teach it with love. And every night, when the wind carries his muffled screams across the yard, I'll sit on my porch, sip my coffee, and know one thing. The father he disrespected, the father he tried to kill, is the father who had the last word, forever.